Hello, welcome to Collective Conscious, episode 7 out of Infinity. Today, we are going to be talking about suffering, specifically two potentially contrasting philosophies of suffering, one of those being the Buddhist view of suffering, and the other one being the Judeo-Christian view of suffering. And so, before Junwei and I get into this, I just want to throw out a disclaimer. Neither Junwei nor I are claiming to be experts on the theology which we are going to attempt to describe. In fact, neither of us even grew up practicing the religion which we are going to attempt to describe. And so this isn't intended to be a conversation between two experts on the theologies that we're talking about. It's more so a conversation about the perceived historical evolution of the philosophy of suffering and what sort of insights we can draw from that in either the similarities or the differences between them. So Junwei is going to be talking about the Buddhist viewpoint, and I will be talking about the Judeo-Christian viewpoint. So Junwei, why don't you start off?
Yeah, so the Buddhist term, or the Sanskrit word for suffering, is dukkha, and suffering is really just a big umbrella word for anything that, causes pain, sadness, like uneasy feelings or uncomfortableness. And the main notion with Buddhism is that the root of suffering comes from attachment, and with attachment, it's because of the existence of expectations, right? So to give a more general view, sometimes when you're applying for a job, and part of me thinks that if I put all my effort in crafting this perfect cover letter, getting the perfect references and making the perfect resume, there's a part of me that thinks that because I work this hard, I deserve this job, and I expect to get this job. But that's just simply not true. Just because I would say you're entitled to your actions, but you're not entitled to the fruits of your actions, right? So there's a lot of things in life you can't control, like getting a job or asking a girl out and expecting her to say yes. And why is there suffering, or in that case is because it's a large deviation from your expectations, and when that goes awry, that is what causes suffering.
So from that description, it seems to me like there are two primary differences between the Judeo-Christian standpoint and the Buddhist standpoint. So I think the first one, and probably the more important one, is how we should approach suffering in general. And it seems to me what the Judeo-Christian standpoint would say is that, and specifically the Christian standpoint, I'm going to make that specification for this part specifically. Suffering is something we should undergo voluntarily in order to redeem ourselves in some sense, specifically from our sins, often case. The other main difference that I see between how you describe the Buddhist standpoint and the Judeo-Christian standpoint, as I understand it, is the actual cause of suffering and whether or not we have control over whether we suffer. So it seems like a Buddhist might say, you don't have to suffer if you live appropriately and free yourself from attachment, right?
Yeah, Buddhists would say that, to lessen suffering or to get rid of suffering is to cultivate detachment, which is the opposite of attachment.
Right. So I can see that makes sense. The way I would describe the Judeo-Christian standpoint is more based around the fact that in some sense life is suffering and suffering is unavoidable. There's nothing we can do to eliminate suffering from our lives. What we can do is choose how to interpret it. And so I see that as actually a very fundamental difference in how suffering is even viewed. So I'm curious, just taking aside what a typical Buddhist might say versus what a typical Christian might say, what do you actually personally think about whether suffering is truly avoidable or not?
For me personally, I don't think it's possible to avoid suffering entirely in your entire life. I just don't think that's, if you just think about even the most devoted monks or religious people in Buddhism, I think they would still admit that they go through suffering, and I think for them it might just be how they interpret it and how much they let it affect them. But in general, I don't think you can avoid suffering in life. You just can't.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I actually haven't really made up my mind on that, whether you can avoid it or not, because I'm thinking about a situation where someone might. This is an extreme case, but let's say someone, their goal is to avoid suffering or to minimize their amount of suffering if they can't avoid it. And so what they do is they sit alone in their room all day doing the bare minimum in order to ensure that they survive. Would they really experience any suffering if they did that? I wonder. I mean, it's hard to say because it's partly dependent on emotional reactions too, I suppose, right?
Well, this is kind of meta, but your theory about a person sitting in a room and doing the bare minimum, and whether that causes them suffering or not. Well, now they have an expectation that like it won't cause them suffering. So literally anything you can do would have, even in your kind of like you're trying to, you know, go like in that
Complete
route.
minimal
Yeah,
lifestyle. Yeah,
even that like has an expectation on it. So like
that's true. So how, maybe you probably don't know the answer to this, or I won't say probably, you might not know the answer to this, but what is the path to removing attachment then? Is it possible? I mean, of course they would say it's possible, but how would you even do it?
yeah, I mean, one of the big questions for me is that like there's a lot of things in life that it's very possible and realistic to cultivate detachment. So, it's fine to apply for a job and like once you receive the rejection letter, like it's fine to be sad, but you don't have to get bent out of shape out of it, right? There's a vast difference between being sad and like feeling kind of down versus like suffering. There's a big difference there, right? Like you can be sad without suffering.
That's true.
Another thing is like one of my questions for this philosophy was, it's fine to cultivate detachment for like, getting a job or like asking to go out, kind of small things in life. But what about like grieving, like a loss of like a best friend or like a breakup, like something you're inherently like attached to, like your girlfriend or a parent or a best friend? Like how do you just tell yourself like to you can't like it's kind of hard to automatically detach from that person, right? You have to go through the grieving process. So I would say in the more minute cases like asking a girl out or getting a job, things are not super consequential, but although sometimes they might be, versus like pretty life heavy things like losing a loved one or a breakup. I think there's a difference between those two things.
I think an important question, even before asking, how could you possibly detach yourself from something like a relationship or a friendship, family, grieving? Do you even want to detach yourself from something like that? Because it seems to me that detachment would also maybe not entirely remove, but at least highly mitigate a sense of fulfillment that you might otherwise get from that. Like, let's just go with a simple example, right? You're asking a girl out. If you're not attached to the outcome, then why would you be happy if she says yes?
I think the difference there is that, detachment doesn't mean not caring. It doesn't mean apathy. It just means you're not bent out of shape when she says no. Like you still care that to ask a girl out. You still care if she says yes. You have wants and you have needs and you have desires. It's just that you don't freak out. You don't like sit in your house all day and ruminate about like if I had done this, she would have said yes, or if I had done this, she would have said yes. Like, you don't, there's like a pretty fine line there between like caring about whether a girl says yes versus like being devastated, and I think there's a difference there.
That's a good point. So it's like taking it easy.
Yeah, in a way. But going back to your original point, like I would agree that like if you kind of like someone close to you passes away and you just kind of detach yourself and say like I choose not to suffer because of this. I just personally wouldn't agree with that mindset, and that I think that would just be honestly pretty robotic in my mind to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure I really would want to. As much as suffering is, well, this is circular logic. As much as suffering is suffering, it doesn't mean it has to be avoided necessarily. There is such a thing as justified suffering. When something horrible happens, it doesn't mean that you necessarily did anything wrong, in my view. So that's probably where I would mostly disagree with the Buddhist viewpoint, is that suffering doesn't mean that you did something wrong by definition. Like, it could mean that you did something wrong, but it doesn't have to mean that. Not in all circumstances.
Yeah, and I think that like suffering, it might be necessary for you to suffer in order to let go or have acceptance of something happening, right? So like in a breakup, like you can't just truly let go or be, no one's has accepted a breakup. I mean, some people have, but most people are not accepting of a breakup, the day after or the week after, right? They need some time to recover and grieve, right? And I think that process of suffering, when you're actually grieving over the relationship, that allows you to accept the relationship ending at a later time. But you need to have that period of suffering in order to get to the acceptance stage. You just can't skip directly to the acceptance stage. I don't think human emotions work like that, right?
I agree. I don't think there's a way to really short circuit the system in a sustainable way. Like maybe you can do it in a short term sense, convince yourself that you can short circuit the system for now. But in my view, that always comes back one way or another, whether you recognize it or not. Like you might not recognize that that is why you're suffering at some given moment because you skipped it before. But it seems to me that it still must take place one way or another. It's sort of like a maintained equilibrium over time. Like all things that must happen will happen.
So what do you say from that view that kind of like engages with a Judeo-Christian standpoint that you kind of you're not really voluntarily, like after a breakup, you're not voluntarily taking in suffering, but rather like there's not really nothing else you can do to avoid it. So like, in a way, it's you can't avoid it, right? So you have to engage with it.
Yeah, I think you have to engage with it. I don't think there's any point in running away from it. One key aspect, from what I understand of the Christian viewpoint of suffering, though, is that in order to, in a sense, redeem yourself, or in order to make yourself virtuous or pure, you must undergo suffering. I think part of that is related to the fact that Jesus suffered for our sins is one primary belief, of course. So the concept that we would follow somewhat in his footsteps would be the path to, I don't want to use the word enlightenment, but virtue maybe, or you could just say like heaven even, but the path to true fulfillment. And parts of that I definitely agree with. Parts of that, I'm not sure you can really attain fulfillment truly without having suffered for it. Otherwise, it just feels cheap, right? So, like, if you're getting over a breakup or trying to get over a breakup, if you don't feel sadness, then how are you ever going to feel the fulfillment of the relationship as a whole, even if it's over now? It just seems to me that if you skip the sadness, then you can never appreciate it as a whole.
So you're saying that like for a breakup, you can't really appreciate all the good memories without going through the sadness first?
Yeah, pretty much. It just doesn't make sense to me that you can value something very positively and then not suffer when it's taken away. Otherwise, you would lead to the question of whether you really valued it in the first place. So one way or another, I think voluntarily undergoing the suffering that shows that it was a positive thing at some point is probably a good choice.
So Tyler, let me ask you, what are your personal views on suffering, and like going back to the original question of do you think it's possible to avoid suffering, and if not, like how do we go about it? I mean,
yeah, I don't think it's possible to avoid suffering no matter what you do. I think in a sense it sounds depressing, or it might sound like straight out of Schopenhauer's work, but life really is suffering because, and this is the reason that I think that life as we are born into it is not blissful. We have to work to achieve happiness. We have to work to achieve protection, bliss, all the things that we desire. Those don't come naturally just because we're alive, but suffering in a sense does, because if we don't do anything, we will ultimately suffer and probably die. That's like the natural state. You have to put energy into the system to avoid that. And so I don't think it's possible to completely avoid it, basically. I think it's an intrinsic part of being alive is that you will suffer. And whether you accept that as okay or not, I mean, that's up to the individual person. Some people might accept that and then feel that the appropriate action is something like suicide even. And logically, honestly, I could understand that even though I don't agree with it for myself. But no, I don't think you can avoid suffering altogether. It's just too tied into life itself, in my view.
Okay, so I think we can both say that we agree on the general view of suffering, that it can't be avoided and we must go through it in order to get to where we are, right?
Yeah, I agree. I also think, and I touched on this briefly before, but without undergoing suffering, I'm not sure you could reach any sense of true fulfillment for the positive things that you attain. Like, for example, someone given a pile of money for nothing probably won't feel as satisfied as someone who worked their ass off for the same amount of money. And that's just a hypothesis. I mean, I can't prove that, but that is what I believe.
And I think there's something to be said about, and we haven't really talked about this yet, but the concept of expectations. So we talked about attachment, we talked about suffering, but in terms of expectation, I think for me personally, there's a real, practical thing I see where it's just like when I have an expectation, a really high expectation, and it's not met, like I usually suffer because of that. And it's usually, when you focus on, you hear the saying, you focus on the action and not the outcome. And when you do that, somehow your life turns around when you adopt that philosophy of focusing on the actions and not the outcomes. So what do you think about that?
I think it makes sense because ultimately all we can really control is our actions. We can't control the outcomes because we can't control other people. So it doesn't make sense to harp on the outcomes necessarily. All we can do is take the best actions possible. And so in some sense, that's all that we should really focus on. But of course, what defines the best actions possible is partly determined by the outcome.
Yeah, it seems to me that in order to focus on your actions, you also have to have a sense of like where that action will lead to. So at the same time, you kind of need a goal. You need an outcome, because how do you, like, one of the problems I kind of grapple with this is like, if you don't have an outcome, how do you, like, where do you set the bar? Like, how do you know if the bar is moving or not, right? And like you need, I feel like for me, I could be wrong about this, but like you need some kind of progress to see where you're going, or else how do you know if you're going backwards or forward, right?
Right, exactly. The way I see it is that if you don't have some sort of value system determining, let's just say, your preferences between possible outcomes, how could you possibly decide between what actions you want to take? You'd just be doing stuff randomly if you had no attachment to the outcome or no expectation of what the outcome will be. Like, if you go in with the view that you're going into a college class or something, let's say, right? And you have no expectation of what your final grade is going to be, then you're just going to behave completely randomly. You have to have some sort of expectation of what your actions will lead to in order to know what action to take at all.
I mean, in that case, if we truly dig in, and if you like, let's say you didn't have an expectation on your final grade, but you still like worked as hard as you could for every test and paper, wouldn't that kind of be the same result, even though you don't have an expectation, but you still work hard?
What's the reason for working hard if you don't have the expectation, though? I mean, you still have the expectation that working hard will give you a better chance of having a good grade, right? Otherwise, why would you do it?
Right. So you're saying like we still need like a bar there to see.
I think we have to have some sort of expectation of what the outcome of our actions will be or will probably be.
Okay, that's fair.
I know that it's probably the case that someone more versed in the actual philosophy behind Buddhism would be able to respond to this, but it just doesn't seem to me that you can completely separate expectation from action without just behaving completely randomly at that point.
I think a better example than the class one to really apply it to our daily lives is like, people have a common goal of, losing weight, right? So like I have like, some people might have a goal of like, say I want to lose 10 pounds, right? So that's a goal, right? That's an outcome. But like losing 10 pounds isn't like, what is that like actually by itself? It's not anything. Like you can't just lose 10 pounds. Like that's the outcome. But like, what do you have to do to lose 10 pounds? You have to like go to the gym. You have to like eat foods with less calories or healthier foods. and that's like taking part in the action. But like just saying you want to lose 10 pounds doesn't, it's not going to get you anywhere at all, literally.
Yeah, that's true. So do you think that that's focusing on the actions that you're taking is removing the expectation then instead of focusing on losing 10 pounds?
Yeah.
Is that what you would say?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. I mean, I can understand that. It still seems to me that there's no way to completely separate the expectation from the reason for taking those actions in the first place. But also, just from a psychological point of view, I don't know how you would set goals for yourself without having some sort of expectation. Maybe it's the case that it's not an expectation of accomplishing the goal you set, but just the desire to accomplish the goal. I could see that. But I think humans are really driven by visualizing their desires and going after them. And so if you don't have an expectation of what the final outcome will be, I think it's going to be a lot harder to get anywhere near it, just from a practical point of view.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I don't, one of the things I struggle with this philosophy is like, if you don't have an expectation and you don't, how do you feel fulfillment from like accomplishments then? It feels kind of hard to do that then.
Right. Exactly. I would agree with that for the most part. So one thing that I also want to talk about with this is what we think about the actual origins of why these philosophies came about the way that they did, like why Christians and Buddhists view suffering the way that they do. So I'll talk about the Christian one again. It seems that their viewpoint of suffering is almost like a defense mechanism of sorts in order to be able to accept the inevitability of the suffering. So what I mean is, if you're suffering, right, and there's no way to avoid it, you probably want to tell yourself that there's a greater reason for it. And so having the belief that you will be rewarded for your suffering in the end and that it's virtuous is a very simple way to do that. So it seems to me that really what these, or at least this philosophy does, is it allows people to have a sense of acceptance over potentially horrible lives. And I can definitely understand that. I mean, it's hard to cope with the brutality and the misery of life without believing that there's some reason for it to be so painful. It would be really depressing if there was no reason behind the pain. So I can definitely understand why that philosophy may have come about.
Yeah, one thing that just reminded me of is how suffering relates to how some people are optimistic or some people are optimists and some people are pessimists, and that I think that kind of correlates with the existence of expectations. It's like if you're optimistic about something, you have like high expectations, and then if you're pessimistic about something, you have low expectations of something happening. And then I'm constantly going back and forth with whether like being an optimist or being a pessimist would be just like which one would lessen suffering in my life. And I think it's honestly for me on a case-to-case basis, but
what about agnostic?
Just like, what's your definition of that?
Well, you could say that the optimist has an expectation of something positive, the pessimist has an expectation of something negative, and the agnostic has
No expectation.
Either no expectation or, yeah, no, I'll say it that way, no expectation, basically.
I guess the agnostic would be pretty aligned with the Buddhist view then.
Probably, yeah. It sounds like it.
Have detachment, and like because you're cultivating detachment, you won't have any expectations. So
I think living life pessimistically universally is probably unnecessary misery. Because if you really think about it, we spend more time thinking about the outcome of something than we spend time experiencing the actual outcome. Like if you're trying to ask out a girl, you're spending more time thinking about doing it than you're actually spending doing it.
So much more time, at least like 10 times more. Like just thinking
Right.
about all the scenarios, playing out in your head, thinking about exactly what you should say. And then when it comes to actually doing the action, it's like 10 seconds.
Right.
Yeah.
So really, what's worse, being pessimistic and unjustified or being optimistic and unjustified? Because if you're spending a lot more time in that anticipation phase, wouldn't it theoretically be better to be optimistic?
Like you might as well, right? Like
Right.
all things equal, you might as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you're optimistic and justified, that's clearly the optimal outcome, right? So I would say that optimism is probably more logically valid, but I'd have to think about whether being agnostic is how that would compare to optimism and pessimism. I'd have to think about that some more, I think.
Yeah, going back to your question about the origins of suffering for each philosophy, I think for mine, I don't actually know a whole lot about this, but I know that the story of Buddha, and suddenly, like, he was born into a really rich family, and he had all these possessions, and he had like multiple wives, for the most pleasure he can attain, right? And some days he didn't really feel fulfilled by having all these things, so he decided to like let everything go, right, and like live a life just like by himself and not have any material possessions. And one day he was sitting under like a fruit tree, and I think an apple or some fruit hit his head, and that suddenly he became enlightened, so to speak.
Sounds like Newton.
It is basically Newton, but a long time ago, before him. And so I don't know the full story with that, but I just know that would probably relate to that. Material goods. It's generally better to have experiences than things for happiness research, and that happiness comes within and not from external sources.
I agree that happiness comes from within, certainly. Certainly. In a sense, I actually think that the Buddhist viewpoint of suffering might actually be more optimistic than the Christian viewpoint of suffering, because the Buddhists actually believe that you can prevent it. The Christians are more pessimistic about it. They don't think you can prevent it. They just want to believe that there's a purpose for it or a reason for it so that they can accept it. But the Buddhists, they believe that you can actually stop it. That seems to me to be more optimistic.
The question is, like, can you actually stop it, like, realistically for a Buddhist? Like, in theory you can, but can you actually?
I think you can definitely mitigate it, but I don't think it's worth it. I don't think that's a worthwhile objective. I don't think that you should seek suffering specifically, but if it's a consequence of something that you are trying to attain, I don't think it should necessarily deter you.
It seems like what you're saying is that, both are at kind of pretty far extremes, and you're saying that the best might be just to combine the both and find like a pretty good middle ground, right?
Maybe. I mean, I'm not really sure how much of the Christian viewpoint I really agree with ultimately, because I do, for the most part, see it as a coping mechanism more than anything else. And perhaps the Buddhist one too. I think the Buddhist one gives more of a guide to action, which in a sense I appreciate, because it's not just telling you to sit there and accept that it has some greater purpose. Like, to me, that is a little bit defeatist, and I don't want to promote a defeatist attitude toward it either. I don't think suffering has any greater meaning. I don't think that you'll be rewarded in any way for suffering now. I just don't believe that. And so I can't really say I necessarily agree with the Christian viewpoint, but the part of the Buddhist viewpoint I don't agree with, as I've been saying, is that the objective should be to minimize the amount of suffering. That just doesn't seem to me to be a worthwhile goal to strive for. It's almost a little shallow to me.
One thing with the Buddhist viewpoint that I can get on board on, and you actually mentioned this in a previous podcast episode, I believe, on authenticity, which is that the death of human arrogance is to think that you can control another human being's, you can control another being, let alone your own life. And I feel just that statement alone gives me a lot of acceptance of the way things are in my life personally, or the way things work in the world. And just like that statement alone, just the process of letting go really, and why that makes you feel better, is just the acceptance part. And something about acceptance makes you just feel a little more calmer and a little more, quote unquote, accepting, for lack of a better word, that like things are just the way they are, and that you can't control anyone but yourself. And for a lot of things in life, that would help you, get through the grieving process faster for anything. Just knowing that you can't control another human being, you just can't.
Yeah, acceptance of the nature of reality is definitely important. People definitely suffer unnecessarily through the lack of acceptance, or maybe through the lack of acceptance, the lack of willingness to accept the nature of reality or the nature of whatever happened to them. People put themselves through a lot of pain. Even just thinking about, whether you're thinking about the past or the future, you could say the same about the pessimist, except what they're putting themselves through is related to a future event rather than a past event. You don't have to put yourself through suffering. It's not going to reward you in itself, like I was saying before. At least that's my viewpoint. Suffering on its own has no meaning, but it's not the end of the world.
Right.
You do have to, at a certain point, just accept the way things are and what you do and don't have control over.
At the same time, though, and this touches on our original points, but it is sometimes necessary to go through suffering in order to be better at the other end, right? You can't, as we said, we can't skip through that process.
You can't be scared. You really can't be scared. Something that Nietzsche said that I find really interesting is that people will often say that they are doing things for a moral reason, or not specifically not doing things for a moral reason, when the real reason is that they're just too afraid to do it. But they'll hide that with virtue. And I think that's definitely true. People will claim that there's some greater reason for them either doing or not doing something, when the real reason they're either doing it or not doing it is fear of that action or inaction. And so I think you could apply that similarly to suffering, perhaps, where people are just afraid to undergo suffering for something greater. And so they might claim that suffering should be avoided, but they might just be afraid of facing it head on.
So what are some common examples you see in daily life? That
Fear of rejection. I think that's probably the biggest one. That's the first one that popped into my head, at least. Fear of rejection is a huge, huge motivator that's completely irrational, right? I mean, really, what is the cost of being rejected?
You're exactly the way you were before.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Without
your ego might be damaged a little bit, but
minus some emotional grief, but that comes with it.
Yeah, I think that's what you have to not be afraid of, is that, I mean, for this example specifically, the emotional grief. But in general, I just don't think suffering is something to fear. It's something to utilize and learn from, because it's unavoidable. It's like running away from a lion your entire life. What have you really accomplished? I mean, you've run away for as long as you can, but what have you done if that's your goal, just to avoid the lion? Wouldn't it be better to not fear the lion, but to try to do something greater in spite of it, whether or not it kills you?
Yeah. It seems like one catalyst for suffering is like the idea of uncertainty. So I feel like, as your examples pointed out, the fear of something happening is greater than the thing happening itself. So, the fear of rejection is way bigger than the rejection itself. The fear of breaking up is way bigger than the breakup itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's the conceptualization of possibilities that provides the most suffering. It's not the actualization of them. That's how I would phrase it, at least.
So, Tyler, as we close here, do you have any takeaways from this episode and how our viewers can apply this to their daily lives?
Yeah, I think my takeaways would be not to be afraid, primarily, like we were just saying. There's no utility in basing your life around minimizing the amount of suffering, unless you're just extremely nihilistic or something, which is, I mean, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with that logically, but to me it seems like a waste of time, really. And then the other takeaway would be to not fall into the trap of feeling virtuous for your suffering, not fall into the trap of, I think something that people do a lot is they turn themselves into a victim. They turn themselves into the ultimate sufferer in some sense. There's really no point in doing that. It's not serving a greater purpose. It's just it's almost selfish in a sense to attempt to turn yourself into the ultimate victim, turn yourself into the ultimate sufferer, the ultimate martyr. It doesn't seem to me that that actually accomplishes anything.
Yeah, I can agree with that. As far as my takeaways, how they go, I would say that one, suffering is inedible in life, and you can try as hard as you want to avoid it, but someday, which is probably pretty soon, you're going to suffer someday. You probably already have multiple times.
A couple times.
Couple times. So that's the first thing. And second thing is that like suffering doesn't mean like it's the end of the world, right? I mean, it feels like devastation the first few days of whatever happened, like you're suffering. It feels like you're devastated, but you know, you're still alive, you're still breathing, you're still here. You can still do stuff, right? So I think the other thing is like let your suffering manifest itself if it needs to, and like experience the whole range of human emotions as need be to go through the suffering. So, you know, allow yourself to feel what you feel and just go through the process, right? And this is like the answer to a lot of problems with suffering, but like time. You need I hate the answer time because like you can't control time, and you can't speed it up, you can't slow it down. It's just there, but sometimes that's just to kind of a cheesy way to end all. That's just the way life is sometimes. Yeah.
Cheesy, but frustrating at the same time. Time is probably the most frustrating antidote ever created. It's awful.
Can't do anything about it. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, actually, my last closing thought is going to be this. If you really want an alternative to everything, just get a Xanax prescription and overdose on that. And honestly, you'll be fine. So that's my alternative takeaway for those of you who are actually more on the nihilistic side.
And so our second disclaimer is to not do that.
Hey, I said you better get a prescription, so it's all legal here, boys. All right. We'll wrap it up there. I think this was pretty interesting to talk about, especially hearing from different perspectives, both between you and I, but also historically, and the culmination of ideas that have been generated over thousands of years. It's interesting to hear the differences between